Welcome to Interpersonal Communication, Principles and Practice, Chapter 11, Conflict. Let's begin by looking at our chapter objectives. After studying this chapter, you should be able to do the following. Define interpersonal conflict. Explain how interpersonal conflict can be positive and negative. List and explain the components of interpersonal conflict. Explain social judgment theory and its three latitudes. Name and explain common sources of interpersonal conflict. Describe how to manage your own anger and the anger of others. Define and describe the disinhibition effect and when it might occur. Define power and its role in interpersonal conflict. Explain each of the 7 types of power, and explain each of the 5 conflict management strategies. As always, I encourage you to read the chapter carefully. I may not necessarily lecture at length on every single one of these, but the information is contained within the text. When we think about conflict, a lot of images come to mind, like the metaphors that are listed here. We usually think of conflict as a disagreement, an argument, a fight. You might think of it as a war, a bargaining table, or you might have more positive ideas about conflict, like you might consider it a game or even a heroic adventure. But because we have all these different images in our mind when we hear the word conflict, it's important to define the term as we're going to use it here, to define the term in interpersonal communication contexts. The definition of interpersonal conflict that we're going to be using in this class and in the context of this lecture is a bit lengthy. There are 5 different elements to it, so I want to break it down and deconstruct it and take them one at a time, so we are all starting from the same place and talking about the same concept. Interpersonal conflict has been defined as an expressed struggle between 2 interdependent parties who perceive incompatible goals and scarce resources and who perceive interference from the other party. Now that's a lot, so let's take these things one at a time. Interpersonal conflict is an expressed struggle. Expressed means you have told the other person about it or they know about it. Both of you understand that there's a disagreement or a conflict. If you have a secret disagreement with somebody, you're not in conflict. Conflict happens when you engage in communication with the person and indicate that there's some sort of disharmony between you. That's what the expressed part of expressed struggle means. Interpersonal conflict happens between 2 interdependent parties. We've talked a lot in our relationship units about what interdependence means. It means the 2 of you depend on each other for resources, for support, that what one of you does affects the other person. Okay, you can't really have a conflict with someone that you're not interdependent with because their opinion won't matter to you in that case. So you have to have some sort of dependence on this person in your own life. You perceive that you have incompatible goals. Now note the word perceive. You may not have incompatible goals. You really need to talk about what is the topic of this conflict. What is it that we're disagreeing about? But there's a perception that your goals are incompatible, that you both can't have what you want in this situation. There's a perception that there are scarce resources. In other words, there isn't enough time or money or other resources for both of you to fully have what you want. So you have to choose one or the other to some extent. And you perceive interference or an obstacle from the other party. In other words, you perceive that to some degree, the other person is going to try to keep you from getting what you want. So you have to make a case for your own position. So going back to the full definition of interpersonal conflict, an expressed struggle between two interdependent parties who perceive incompatible goals, scarce resources, and interference from the other party. Now that we've defined conflict, let's look at the elements or the components of a conflict. What kind of issues are present in a conflict? Well, first there's the topic that the conflict is about, or the issue that the conflict is about. It's useful, again, to define this and make sure you agree on what you are arguing about or what you are in conflict about with your conversational partner. So the issue is one component of the conflict. A second component is the relational dynamics that you have with this person, the state of your relationship, what kinds of intimacy and self-disclosure you have experienced in the past, and what might be the implications of this conflict for the future of your relationship. All those relational dynamics become another component of the conflict. And thirdly, there's the process by which you're going to resolve the conflict. This means the rules or expectations you have for the procedure of working through the conflict. Perhaps you and this person are accustomed to having very emotional fights where you raise your voices and use foul language. Maybe you're more accustomed to sitting down and discussing things with this person calmly. But there is a process. There are some implicit or explicit rules and expectations for how the conflict resolution procedure is going to progress. So you have these three components in every conflict. You have the issue or topic that the conflict is about. You have the relational dynamics that already exist between you, and you have your implicit or explicit rules for how you process a conflict situation with this partner. Let's examine some common sources of conflict in our relationships with friends, family, loved ones, significant others. First, personal criticism. Remember, criticism means pointing out somebody's faults or flaws as you perceive them. That can give rise to defensiveness on the part of the other person, and that can escalate into a conflict. Criticism was one of the four horsemen we studied in the last chapter, and any of those four horsemen can give rise to interpersonal conflict. Finances and money. If you combine your finances with somebody else, as in a family situation or a marriage, you can have disputes over how that money is to be spent because you both have access to the same pool of money, yet you both have the power to spend it and put it out of the bank account. So if you feel your partner is not spending money wisely by your own standards, that can give rise to conflict. Household chores. If you've ever had a roommate, you're familiar with this one. People who share the same dwelling space often have different ideas about how that space is to be used and maintained. So that can cause disputes between you. Time. Time is an important resource in a relationship. How much time do you spend together? How much time do you spend with other people? Do both partners agree that your time is divided in a proper way? And then all of these sources of conflict are affected by other phenomena, such as sex and gender dynamics, the culture in which you are engaging in conflict. It could be a culture where people are expected to express their dissatisfactions, or it could be a culture focused on face saving and keeping quiet about anything negative. And then online interactions can be a common source of conflict also. Those text messages, those online chats, or situations where you might be hiding behind anonymity, and we'll talk about that more as well. Computer-mediated communication can give rise to special kinds of conflict, and it's often because of something called the disinhibition effect. So think about what disinhibition would mean. It would mean losing your inhibitions, right? Oftentimes when we are hiding behind a computer as an anonymous person, or even right now when I'm talking to you and you know me and I know you, but there's this computer screen between us. It's a barrier. Sometimes we might be meaner or more frank than normally. We might engage in hate speech when we normally wouldn't. Or we might self-disclose differently than we would in a face-to-face situation. So those phenomenon are called the disinhibition effect, or it's a lowering of your inhibitions when you're in a mediated environment, for good or for bad, right? So some ways that we can control how much we're affected by that are, first, don't respond right away. Say you get an email that makes you angry and you're really tempted to fire off a response and send it. It is useful to take a little time before you react. That will help you to mitigate any disinhibition you might be feeling. You don't want to necessarily put your boss on blast. It might be bad for you later. So don't respond right away. Draft a response. Do a draft and put it away for a day and come back to it and really think about, is that what I want to say? You can also ask for clarification. This can kind of buy you some time and also mitigate the disinhibition effect. You can say, you know, it sounds like you're asking me to do X. Am I understanding you correctly? Again, that buys you a little time. It gives the person more of a chance to explain themselves, and it might de-escalate any anger that you might be feeling. Let's examine some commonly used conflict management styles, or ways we have of trying to handle and work our way through a conflict. Now, we talk about 5 different styles in this chapter, but none of us has only one style. You can't just stamp, compromising on a person's forehead. These are all contextual, okay? We might use each of these in different situations, and as we work our way through them, you might see that you yourself have used all of these at different times with different people, okay? So let's work our way through these, starting with competing. If you're using a competing conflict management style, you want to win. You want to get your own way. Okay, so you're going to be pushing for your own position. You're going to be arguing for your own position. You're trying to be persuasive. You're trying to bring the other person around to your point of view, whether it be through logic or through coercion or through any of the persuasion techniques that we've talked about before. At times, you might use the conflict management style of avoiding. You might disengage from the conflict. You might want to ignore it. You might hope that it goes away on its own. You might want to sweep it under the rug. You might do this in interest of keeping the peace in the moment or delaying the inevitable discussion. The danger of the avoiding conflict management style is that these issues tend to keep bubbling back up to the surface until we deal with them. So avoiding is not ideal, but there are times that we do choose it, when we just we know our emotions are high, or we just don't know how to resolve this issue, we might avoid it for the time being. The accommodating conflict management style, think about what it means to accommodate somebody else. It means to subordinate your own will to the other person's will. So when you're using an accommodating conflict management style, you're willing to let the other person have their own way. Okay, so it's kind of the opposite of the competing style. Now, why would you choose the accommodating style? It doesn't necessarily mean that you're a doormat, although some people are, but you might choose the accommodating style because you're trying to achieve equity in your relationship and it's that person's turn to choose how things go, or as a gesture of love or caring for that person, or maybe because your position is not as strong as theirs and you know that they really want something. So it can be a relational maintenance behavior to engage in accommodating. Compromising and collaborating. I'm going to talk about these two together because people easily confuse them with each other. Compromising means neither party gets 100% of what they want. So I have a position, you have a position, we discuss it. In the end, I'm going to get some of the things I want and you're going to get some of the things you want, but we both give up something too. So a compromise is a situation that doesn't fully satisfy either person. You're willing to go along with it in order to resolve the conflict in the moment, but you didn't really get what you wanted and neither did your partner. So maybe you want to go out for pizza, they want to go out for Chinese food, and you agree to go to a place that serves both but doesn't do the food as well as a restaurant that does only pizza or only Mexican. So you both got what you wanted to eat, but you didn't get as high a quality of a result that you really wanted. So you both feel like you got something and gave up something, if that makes sense. That's compromising. Neither party's going to be 100% happy with the outcome. Collaborating, we're familiar with this word in a general sense. It means coming to an agreement with somebody else. But as a conflict management style, collaborating means that you each are willing to kind of throw out your original idea and come up with a new and unique idea that works for both of you. Okay, so let's say that you have a certain amount of money to take a vacation with your partner, and your partner would like to go to Disneyland and you would like to go to Washington, D.C. Okay, so we have an incompatibility here and you can only afford one of these trips. So collaborating would be saying, okay, let's come up with an idea that we both really like. Okay, why don't we go to Las Vegas instead? And we can see the sights on the Vegas Strip and we can gamble and we can see shows. Let's put our money there and we'll both enjoy that. That's an example of collaborating. So again, be clear on the difference between compromising and collaborating. Compromising means both parties give a little and get a little, but neither's entirely satisfied. Collaborating means that together you come up with a new idea that you can both be enthusiastic about. As we're deciding how to manage a conflict with our interpersonal partner, whether to collaborate or compromise or compete or use one of the other strategies, social judgment theory gives us some useful tools to apply. Social judgment theory suggests that each of us has a latitude of acceptance or a range of what we would consider reasonable ideas, a latitude of rejection or a range of unreasonable ideas, and a latitude of non-commitment or a range of ideas to which we are indifferent. We don't care one way or another. So when we are managing a conflict, we're going to probably gravitate toward ideas that are within our latitude of acceptance, or if we're willing to compromise and accommodate our partner, we might be willing to venture into our latitude of non-commitment. Your latitude of rejection tends to be the ideas you consider unreasonable. Those might be your deal breakers. So if you think of these on a continuum with the latitude of acceptance at one end, the latitude of non-commitment perhaps in the middle, and the latitude of rejection at the other end, what is it that would push you over the edge from one into the next? What would push you into the latitude of rejection? What would you be willing to do to move your partner from their latitude of rejection into perhaps their latitude of non-commitment, or even into their latitude of acceptance? So when we're trying to resolve a conflict, we have a position and our partner has a position, and we're trying to arrive at a solution that would be within both people's latitude of acceptance, or perhaps in the latitude of non-commitment if you're willing to accommodate your partner to some degree. Now let's shift our focus to the issue of power and how power can have a part to play in a conflict. Let's start by defining power. Power is the ability to manipulate, influence, or control people and events. Now, people often think of power as a pejorative term, meaning as a negative term. When I ask people about times that they've exercised power, they often kind of shrink from that idea that they have power and they exert power over others. But power can be good or bad. It's just the ability to influence what somebody else does. So we're going to look at power in a variety of ways. Remember that power is always context specific. You might have power in one situation and not in another. So no person is powerful in every part of their lives. Power dynamics are always present between human beings, and they can change and shift over time. So you can always look for a power dynamic in any exchange. And as I mentioned a moment ago, it can be positive or negative. Now, some people think that power is a zero-sum game. And what a zero-sum game means is that there's a finite amount of something and that you have to compete for it, right? And if somebody else has more of it, then you have less of it. So there's, one pie, and if I get 2/3 of it, you can only have 1/3 of it. That's a zero-sum game. But power can increase and diminish, and just because I have more power doesn't mean that you have less. We could both increase our power. So in my opinion, power is not a zero-sum game. But if you ask a politician, they'll think it is, because as you know, in Washington, there's so many seats reserved for Republicans, so many seats reserved for Democrats, and they'll talk about the shift or the balance of power. In that context, they do view power as a zero-sum game. If you get more of it, I have less of it. But in our interpersonal relationships, that isn't always the case. Just as we looked at some of the influences on conflict, let's examine some of the influences on power. First of all, sex and gender can be a big influence on power as well as conflict. Remember the rule of the patriarchy. Patriarchal systems tend to attribute more power to males than females. Masculine and feminine communication styles can affect people's perception of your power. In our culture, we tend to favor masculine communication styles. And there's something called the principle of least interest, which I find really fascinating. This is the idea that the person who's less interested has more power. And think about this in cases where you've liked somebody and they're playing hard to get. The fact that they're less interested than you are gives them more power. That's the principle of least interest, that we're going to chase after those who don't meet us halfway. It's a fascinating idea. And then culture can be a big influence on power, especially the dynamic of power distance. Remember, we talked about high and low power distance cultures. High power distance cultures are cultures where the average person is far away from power, right? You're a diminished person. You're a peasant and they're a king, right? And in a high power distance culture, power differences are normal and expected. So people might tend to be more deferential because they are accepting of this idea of differences in power. In a low power distance culture, remember the US is one of these, we consider ourselves close to power and able to interact with power and criticize power. We don't expect power difference. We question power differences. We question, why does that person get to dictate what I can do? We question our leaders. We question our president. We criticize people in positions of power. So whether a culture is high or low power distance is going to have a big influence on how they perceive power and whether people in power have the right to have it or not. Now let's look at some common forms of power. And as we do, I'd like you to think of examples in your own life and times when you might have exercised these kinds of power over other people. Again, the exercise of power over other people isn't necessarily always bad, and we all engage in some of these at different times and in different contexts, okay? Let's start by looking at reward power. Reward power is the ability to give somebody something that they want. Okay, so you have something that they want, or you have the power to give them something that will make them happy. Okay, so for example, if you tell a child, if you're good, I'll let you have a cookie, right? That's a form of reward power. If your boss says, if you do this task, I'll make sure you get more hours on next week's schedule. That's a form of reward power, the ability to give you something positive, something that you would want. Coercive power is the power to punish. So it's the flip side of reward power. It's the ability to make something bad happen to somebody or to give them something that they don't want. Parents are great at using coercive power too. If you do that again, I'll spank you. Or, when we're teenagers, there's often issues of, if you break curfew one more time, I'm going to take your car keys away. Some sort of punishment that the person has the ability to administer gives them coercive power. So think of reward power and coercive power as flip sides of the same coin. And those who have reward power often have coercive power as well. Referent power is the power to motivate you to do something because you admire me, or you like me, or you want to please me. Okay, so someone who's a mentor to you, or maybe an older sibling that you admire, would have the power to use your admiration for them as a way of getting you to do something. Advertisers use this all the time when they put a celebrity in an ad for a product. They're hoping that you will buy that product because you admire that celebrity. So they're utilizing referent power. Think of the word reference. Maybe that will help you to remember this one. The next kind of power we'll talk about is legitimate power. And the thing to remember about legitimate power is that it rests in a title or position of a person, and it has institutional backing. What I mean by that is, say we're talking about the President of the United States. That position of President of the United States confers power no matter who the human being is who occupies that office. So that's legitimate power. It comes along with the position and it's institutionally backed. Another way to think of legitimate power is with your professors. I walk in the door the first day of class and say, I'm your professor. Here's the syllabus. Here's what we're going to do this term. Do this, do that. You don't know me at that point. You don't know what my qualifications are. But the fact that I have the title of professor and the backing of Western Michigan University confers a certain degree of power on me and causes you to listen to me and to comply with my requests. Now, you might later decide that I'm an idiot or I'm unworthy of paying attention to, but in that moment, I have legitimate power. Same way when you start a new job and they tell you that guy over there is the boss. You don't know anything about that guy over there, but the fact that he's the boss confers legitimate power on him and you're going to obey what he asks you to do. Okay. Now, expert power is easily confused with legitimate power, but it's something else entirely. Expert power rests in the individual and in their expertise at doing something. So a brain surgeon has expert power because they can do something that other people cannot do. Your brother-in-law who can fix your car, if you know nothing about car repair, he has expert power in that situation. So it's in the individual and in the talent and expertise that that person has. The lady who gives you piano lessons has expert power. These people might not have titles necessarily, but it is their own knowledge level that gives them their power. So again, people confuse this with legitimate power sometimes, but remember, legitimate power rests in the position and the title and the institutional backing, whereas expert power is in the individual and their own knowledge and talents. Someone with legitimate power might not be an expert necessarily. Okay, then let's look at environmental power. This is the power to control resources. So someone who has environmental power can control space and money and time and things like that. So if I'm your boss and I get to decide what size office you get, that's environmental power. If I get to decide which committee is going to get a bigger budget, that's environmental power. Anything that has to do with resource allocation is environmental power. Then finally, informational power. You've probably heard the saying that information is power. Knowing something that other people don't know can give you an advantage over those people and can give you a form of power. Think about people who know that the financial markets are going to do something before anybody else does. That would be informational power. If I know you're about to get laid off from your job before you know, I have informational power. So this can be used in positive and negative ways, as can all of these, except maybe coercive. Unless you're coercing somebody to do something that's going to keep them safe, that might be a positive use. That's our lecture for Chapter 11 on conflict. As always, please read the textbook thoroughly, contact your instructors with any questions, and we'll see you in the next class.